If you enjoy my work, please consider supporting me on my Patreon or on my Buy Me a Coffee page. The links to both websites are in the description of this video. In many of my videos, I talk about the large-scale societal issues stemming from the mass immigration of people of non-European origin to Western European countries. I honestly believe that allowing this migration was ill-conceived, rushed, and a reckless decision made without the proper societal debate, public support, and honest and competent analysis of its possible impacts. For a long time, critique of this process was swept under the rug by never-ending accusations of racism, Islamophobia, or xenophobia, and politically, the public discontent with this process and the unwillingness of the mainstream political parties to offer some real solutions hugely contributed to the rise of the so-called populist right across the Western world. Today, many Western European countries deal with massive societal issues ranging from loss of social cohesion to huge amounts of money spent on the usually unsuccessful integration of the newcomers. I repeatedly mentioned that mistakes in all kinds of policies, tax, industrial, or educational policies, however damaging they certainly might be, are usually reversible. When the negative effects of such policies become visible, they can be rolled back. That does not mean that this reversal always takes place, or that no massive financial losses are involved. When we look at the European, especially German, energetic policy, propelled by environmental ideology, we are witnessing voluntary deindustrialization of the European economic powerhouse, with potentially disastrous consequences for the continent's future. Even though anyone with at least some basic level of clarity has to see that the dream of net zero economy is incompatible with the functioning of a modern, industrial, wealthy country, no real change of course is taking place. But that is mostly an issue of willingness. If the political classes decided to change course, a lot of it would be a matter of purely technically administrative decisions. Sure, some issues are very hard to reverse. For example, the Germans turning their nuclear power plants off. Once a country signals that it doesn't plan to keep its nuclear industry alive, the human capital needed to operate it slowly disappears. Why would anyone study nuclear engineering in a country that does not plan to operate nuclear power plants? But even that could likely be somehow figured out, possibly by paying huge amounts of money to foreign engineers, something that Germany could definitely afford if it were prioritized. Where there is a will, there is a way. Demographics are different though. Once you allow mass immigration to fundamentally alter the ethnic composition of your country, that is most likely forever. When I mention this, I'm usually confronted with quite a lot of disagreement from some of my viewers. Why would it be forever? It is reversible. We need the so-called remigration. Remigration is a concept that is suggested by certain European politicians campaigning on anti-immigration platforms. For example, Eric Zemmour in France or politicians of the German AfD party. And which is increasingly popular among the European right-wing circles. In this video, I want to discuss why I am firmly convinced that it is basically ruled out in the European context. A little disclaimer at the beginning. In this video, I won't judge the issue from a moral point of view. I want to look at it analytically, from the point of view of conceivability. At the same time, that does not necessarily mean that I would not find the notion morally problematic. Since the proposal has so far been rather ill-defined and vague in its shape, it is hard to take some stance towards its moral implications. It is just not what I want to delve into in this video. What actually is remigration? When politicians talk about it, it is usually framed as a mass deportation of illegal immigrants, criminals of foreign nationality, and foreigners who have not sufficiently integrated into the host countries. The proposal often includes also the process of stripping people of citizenship, for example those that have gained their citizenship fraudulently, in order to enable their deportation. In terms of numbers, Eric Zemmour, in his 2022 French presidential campaign, proposed the deportation of 1 million people, and AfD representatives in Germany talked about millions in plural. When we go one step further, beyond the declarations of politicians that are still functioning within somehow defined Overton window, and into the concepts that are floated around in the internal right-wing debate, online and offline, it often takes the shape of a proposal to effectively alter the demographic composition of European countries to reach some kind of more desirable demographic reality, usually connected to more ethnic homogeneity. It is an attempt to roll back the clock, so to speak, to return to the past in terms of ethnic composition and homogeneity, at least partially. As already mentioned, there are two layers in this proposal. The first is the deportation of citizens of other countries that are on the territory of some state. Turkish or Ukrainian citizens living in Germany, Mexican citizens living in the US, or Indian citizens living in the UK, to name some of the very prominent examples of numerous foreign communities in Western countries. Now, that variant is, in relative terms, less complicated from the technical point of view, even though still far from simple, as I will elaborate on further down the line. And then there is the second possible layer, which alludes to the expulsion of citizens based on some kind of ethnic, cultural, or religious criteria. Since citizens cannot be deported from their country, this would need to be accompanied by massive levels of denaturalization, so stripping people of citizenship. In that case, it is basically a less publicly toxic term for ethnic cleansing based on ethnicity, religion, or perceived level of cultural assimilation to the host society. When you think about it, that is just what it is. So, why do I think it won't happen? Now, to somehow start, it needs to be said that the idea of remigration, so large-scale expulsion of people to achieve the desired level of either cultural or ethnic homogeneity, is, of course, physically possible. It has happened in the past, and it will undoubtedly happen again in the future. What I am talking about is that I do not think it is a conceivable possibility in the context of contemporary Europe, for several societal, political, and technical reasons I will delve into in this video. When you look at the past cases of ethnic cleansing or mass expulsion of the populations, you will find several reoccurring contexts. Most often, there is either a breakup of some state and the creation of a new state or states, territorial changes of some existing state, and most often, it is underpinned by a violent conflict. There are plenty of examples. Germans were expelled in millions from Central and Eastern Europe after the Second World War. As the Ottoman Empire retreated from the Balkans and the Caucasus, many Muslims emigrated or were forced out. Crimean Tatars or Circassians were compelled by the invading Russians to emigrate to Turkey. After the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, millions of ethnic Hungarians and Germans migrated from the newly created nation-states. In 1923, there were large-scale population exchanges between Turkey and Greece. The partition of India in 1947 was both a diplomatic event and a violent conflict that has led to millions of Hindus and Muslims caught in the wrong of the newly emerging countries. During the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s, ethnic cleansing and attempts to create ethnically homogeneous territories from previously highly mixed ones were ubiquitous. In cases of civil wars and ethnic cleansing happening within countries, the most common result is the creation of homogeneous enclaves within countries. The reoccurring contexts present in the presented cases are usually twofold. First is the massively heightened level of violence and chaos that accompanies times of mayhem and war. The second is the existence of states, either newly created or already existing, more or less enthusiastically willing to accept the expelled population, usually since they were their nation-states, and the acceptance of the co-ethnics was thus expected under the national principle. What is also crucial is that these states were almost always neighboring the territories from which the populations were expelled. Now, in some cases, massive distances still needed to be traversed, for example in the case of India and Pakistan. Since most people traveled on foot, this was still often deadly and incredibly brutal. But at least there was some final location, some border that needed to be crossed to reach the new homeland, even though the populations were often treated very harshly, even within their new home countries, and often created a base of some kind of permanent or temporary economic underclass. What is apparent is that both of these crucial contexts are completely absent from current Europe. Now, when people talk about mass deportations or remigration, it is usually a way of signaling one's political opinion, but it very rarely contains some realistic approach towards how this policy should be implemented in practice. Let's start with the comparably less complicated case of deportation of non-citizens and, thus, in a vast majority of cases, citizens of other countries. Every country has the authority to decide who will stay on its territory and who will potentially become its citizen. It is one of the crucial and defining rights of every country. Now, the first thing to mention is that deportations are logistically and administratively very complicated and costly issue. In the contemporary European Union, the rate of successful deportations, or returns as they are euphemistically called, is very low. Only around 20% of people officially ordered to leave actually do so. The most common scenario is that an illegal immigrant or refused asylum claimant gets ordered to leave the country. but this order is then not really enforced by the police or the relevant organs. The vast majority of migrants thus kind of get lost in the shadows and just continue to live in Europe as illegal immigrants. That is understandably very infuriating for people. It creates a feeling of powerlessness and loss of credibility in the power of the legal enforcement organs of European countries. Why are we even bothering with ordering these people to go away if we then do not proceed with the realization of this seemingly empty legal decision? There certainly is some truth in this point of view, and the success rate could very likely be somehow improved if this was made a clear political priority, which it certainly ain't for many governments. However, the matter becomes significantly complicated by the fact that it takes two to tango. Deportation is not a unilateral, but a bilateral issue. While in legal theory, states have the duty to accept their citizens deported from foreign countries, the reality of our contemporary situation is that many states just do not cooperate when accepting their citizens that Western countries decide to deport. The reasons for this are many. In most cases, the source countries of mass migration are economically rather underdeveloped places that usually experience massive population growth and thus have a youthful population without sufficient opportunities to gain the desired position on the socio-economic hierarchy. For most of these countries, emigration is a way to either get remittances or to get rid of unrestful young males who might otherwise cause disturbances at home. Often both. Other reasons are connected to the legitimacy of the ruling classes of the source countries before their populations. Deportations are also seen as symbols of an international power dynamic. The populations in source countries often see deportations of their fellow citizens as a manifestation of their undesirability in the eyes of the more wealthy countries. That creates discontent, and the cooperation of their governments in this regard is often seen more as a collaboration. In short, the governments mostly do not cooperate since they have very little incentive to do so. On the contrary, it carries certain risks for them. While relatively few countries openly refuse to accept their citizens, the most common way of hampering this process is through a non-responsive approach and bureaucratic obstacles. This process usually goes through the embassies of the source countries in the destination countries. The embassies either do not respond at all or claim that they cannot verify the validity of the identification documents of the person and thus are unwilling to acknowledge that the person is their citizen. Many migrants also purposefully remove their documents to make proper identification impossible. When the deportation process hits a wall like that, what is there to do? That is a question without any existing and realistic answer. When an immigrant arrives in Sweden or France and his home country, whether Pakistan, Somalia or Tunisia, just does not play ball and does not allow his return, where would you deport them? You cannot just escort them over the border, since over the border is not Pakistan or Somalia, but Italy or Denmark. You often must go through 10 or 15 countries to reach the source country. What would you suggest? At this point, some kind of far-fetched suggestion usually comes up, like using military power to force the source countries to accept them, or making a deal with some African country to dump a couple of millions of people there. No big deal. Now, let's think about such suggestions. The latter option, making a deal with some unspecified North African country that could take up to 2 million people, was allegedly discussed at the secret right-wing rendezvous that happened last year in Germany. This information then caused mass anti-far right demonstrations all over Germany. Now, when you look at the approach of Arab countries towards potentially accepting refugees from Gaza, they are usually like, well, we fully support our Palestinian brothers in their struggle against the genocidal Zionists. Come on guys, we root for you. Oh, you ask if we will accept some of the potential refugees? Well, nope. But hey, the EU could take some. On a more serious note, it is fair to acknowledge that countries like Egypt or Turkey already host massive refugee populations, and it is causing a lot of internal instability. Do you really think that some country would willingly agree to accept millions of people, presumably an incoherent combination of Arabs, Africans, Kurds, Turks and others, a mass of mostly young males without any internal cohesion and possible economic support, and just accommodate them in some desert shelters? Why would anyone ever do that? That would be a complete political suicide that would inevitably end in catastrophic problems for the country and likely its ruling classes. I cannot imagine the amount of money any country would demand for such a feat. So, what else is there? using military power to force the source countries to accept people they do not want? Can you really imagine that happening? Can you imagine French cargo ships accompanied by military naval escorts, transporting thousands of people to some African country and then dumping them at the shore or in their territorial waters against the will of both the people escorted and the government of the country? Will the German government threaten to perform airstrikes on Baghdad if Iraq won't accept the 250,000 Iraqi citizens in Germany? Or will European countries establish some kind of military protectorate in disintegrating Libya to transport hundreds of thousands of people there? We are talking about Europe, which is not really able to meaningfully influence the military conflict in Gaza, even though it is in its broader neighborhood. Europe that lacks the industrial potential to outperform Russia when it comes to supplying Ukraine with ammunition and such. Europe, which was famously not able to sustain for even a month the relatively small-scale military action in Libya in 2011 and needed American support due to the lack of precise ammunition. Like it or not, contemporary Europe is not 19th century Europe anymore. Very far from it. Contemporary Europe is a largely militarily impotent and economically declining continent. Its international clout is declining rapidly. The times when Europe could basically do whatever it wanted throughout its colonies are long gone. The world does not fear Europe. I often feel like many people still do not really comprehend this reality, both on the political far left and far right. On the left, you have the Greta Thunberg-style white savior line of thinking that sees the non-European world as a bunch of poor, oppressed nations that are to be saved by the moral self-sacrifice of the Europeans in the fight against climate change. The fact that the European contribution to the world's CO2 emissions is effectively negligible does not bother them. Only we can save the world. On the right, there is often a more open form of ethnic hubris, with people seeing themselves as inherently superior, mostly due to the great deeds of their forebears and possibly superior genetics, and thus naturally predisposed to being on the apex of the world order. The current decline is just a matter of cultural degradation imposed by the nefarious alliance of inner enemies and external forces, most often the Jews, which aims to shackle the naturally dominating spirit of the European race. Those views are both equally delusional, out of touch with reality, and full of cope. Contemporary Europeans are not their forebears of the past. No Beethoven symphonies are being composed today. No Notre Dame cathedral is being built. No technological revolutions are happening in Europe, and no foreign continents are being subjugated. That is not some kind of self-defeating black pill talk, just an attempt to grasp the reality of the contemporary world in order to navigate it. Europe is still a great continent on a high civilizational level, full of wealth and economic and human capital. Now, back to the issue of possible remigration. If such conduct were attempted, there would be a massive backlash from many non-Western countries worldwide, whether they were colonies themselves or not, seeing it as some kind of throwback to the colonial past. Sure, you might argue that many such countries do not have the international weight needed to be relevant. Well, some do not, but some do. India, the Gulf countries, Turkey or Indonesia are far from being irrelevant. One can reasonably presume that countries like Russia or China, seeing themselves as competitors of the collective West in one way or another, would also hurry to add more fuel to the fire. So this is the famous West, the beacon of freedom and human rights, transporting humans like cattle in boats, echoing the transatlantic slave trade in the eyes of the world, or making them walk into some ill-prepared desert shelters, echoing maybe the Turkish genocide of Armenians with its dead marches to desert. What would Europe do if the Gulf petromonarchies declared that since Europe is behaving inhumanly towards their fellow Muslims, they will drastically reduce the amount of oil and LNG gas exported to Europe? The external, in terms of international backlash, and internal, in terms of economic costs and the inner social destabilization, price of such an operation would be absolutely staggering. When you really think about these issues in realistic terms, every possible answer just opens several other problems. Europe has been struggling so far even to reduce the number of newcomers arriving in Europe. Looking at the explosive African population growth, it is almost certain that the flow of people trying to get into Europe will go into overdrive in the coming decades. I think that attempts to manage these flows somehow, which could easily outmatch anything seen or imagined to this day, will be enough to completely occupy the European capacities. When the facts outlined above are considered, adamantly not allowing the entrance of undesirable migrants into the territory of Europe is likely the most rational thing to do. It also has a lot of issues connected to it, and it is not as straightforward as it sometimes might seem, but that is a matter for a different video. Once the people are in Europe, the options get drastically reduced. Since the deportation process takes a lot of time, and you have to work with the often non-responsive organs of the source country, one option is to keep the person detained until it is resolved. Since it usually won't get resolved, this can either mean permanent detention of ballooning numbers of people that could reach tens or even hundreds of thousands, something that is unsustainable in the longer term, or looking the other way and play the game of "we will order you to leave and you will do so," with both parties involved knowing it won't happen. Now, these were the external issues. Now, let's go to the internal ones. I do not think people realize the absolutely massive level of internal change and mayhem that would be required for the possibility of remigration to be a viable option. Now, to somehow start with this segment, let's just look at how the efforts of European governments to deal with mass immigration are going. Recently, the French National Assembly has passed laws significantly hardening several policies regarding illegal immigration. The changes encompassed the simplification of deportations, tougher rules of family reunifications, limiting access to welfare, or the introduction of immigrant quotas based on nationality. It was hailed as a large ideological victory by Marine Le Pen and the right-wing politicians. Nevertheless, a ruling by the French Constitutional Court recently made significant changes to the bill. The parts of the bill that limited welfare, hardened reunifications, or introduced immigration quotas were scrapped as unconstitutional by the court. In Italy, Giorgia Meloni was voted into power in 2022, partially due to the promise to dramatically reduce the immigration flows into Italy via the Mediterranean. In December of 2023, at some kind of conservative conference in Rome, she admitted the results were disappointing. More than 150,000 people have arrived from across the Mediterranean without permission in 2023, up from 99,000 at the same time in 2022. Giorgia Meloni admitted that she had not been able to fulfill her campaign pledge to curb the inflow of irregular migrants, calling migration, quote, "the most complex phenomenon I have ever had to delve with." End of quote. I already mentioned the situation in Germany, where the news of the remigration plans of the rightist circles sparked a massive backlash. Large-scale demonstrations all over the country, which, apart from other things, resulted in the loss of the AfD candidate Uwe Trum in the local elections of the district administrator position in the central state of Thuringia on Sunday. Thuringia is one of the heartlands of the AfD, and just 2 weeks ago, the AfD candidate was firmly ahead in the polls. However, after the media storm caused by the information about remigration plans, he was beaten by the candidate of the CDU, Christian Hergot. Apart from the fact that Christian Hergot is kind of a ridiculously perfect name for a Christian Democrat politician, it shows that for the mainstream electorate, these ideas are just unacceptable, at least so far. Now, the politicians who attended the right-wing conference claim that no such plans were presented there, and that it is a smear campaign against the AfD. I have also read that the partially publicly funded web Corrective, which published the information, was just used by the government to take attention from the large-scale protests of German farmers. That may be the case, but it does not really change the fact that Overton Window is absolutely not ready for such proposals. Most attempts to be more effective in the enforcement of border control are met with fierce and successful opposition by the alliance of liberal or progressive journalists, bureaucrats, NGOs, academics, judges, and politicians, who are very effective at hampering such attempts through masterful command of institutions and various legal obstructive methods. The left is very good at playing the institutional game, much better than the right. When you look at the fact that something like the hardening of rules on family reunification or access to social benefits is deemed unconstitutional, you can bet that something like mass deportations would be deemed as unconstitutional as well. The notion of denaturalization, meaning the loss of citizenship, is definitely unconstitutional in most European countries, apart from particular cases like treason. So, that would require constitutional changes. For the change of constitution, some kind of parliamentary supermajority is usually required, like 3/5 or 2/3. Getting these majorities is very hard in parliamentary politics, especially regarding such polarizing topics as immigration. The European public is clearly moving to the right regarding immigration. Still, this process is unlikely to end in some kind of broad-based societal consensus or even a hegemony of hardline anti-immigration stance. When you analyze the rise of the so-called populist right throughout the West in the past 15 years, people might often get the sense that it is some kind of rising tide that will roll over the West and create some kind of completely new power equilibrium. But that does not seem to be the case. Many intellectuals point out that the classic right versus left political division was replaced by a new kind of, let's say, global elitist versus local populist division. I agree with this assessment, but when you look at the development of the past decade or so, it does not seem that one side will soon completely decimate the other and dominate the political landscape. It will likely be a new, long-term division, with the two sides being relatively equal in their powers. Donald Trump won elections in 2016 and then lost in 2020. He might win again this year, but it is far from certain. While Marine Le Pen is gradually gaining more support one French election after the other and might prevail someday, it would be naive to think that it would mean some kind of completely seismic shift within the French society that would suddenly change everything. In Poland, the Law and Justice Party, which could be broadly put in the populist camp, was unable to form a government after last year's elections and was replaced by a government that could be placed more in the global elitist camp. While there likely will be significant right-wing gains in the elections to the European Parliament this year, the projections point to it merely weakening the hegemony of socialists and Christian Democrats, the groups comprising the unofficial ruling bloc within the EU. It certainly won't result in sufficient changes to completely overhaul the institutional domination of the EU by those political forces. Quite far from it. It is illusory to think that when some party gains a few percentage points in elections and can form a government, it will result in their ideology suddenly dominating the society. The populist bloc might often have a slight upper hand in public support, but that is effectively neutralized by the elitist camp's far superior use of institutions. When you examine the actual views of the European public on immigration in social research, the opposers of immigration have an advantage, but it is not a clear societal dominance. In a study done by Pew Research in 2018, 58% of Germans wanted fewer or no new immigrants, while 40% wanted the same amount or more. In Sweden, it was 52% versus 47%. In France, it was actually 41% versus 58% in favor of more or the same level of immigration. Now, those numbers might have somehow shifted since then, likely in the direction opposing immigration. But even the 2022 Eurobarometer survey showed that across Europe, 42% of people said that the integration of immigrants in their countries is totally successful, versus 47% saying it was totally unsuccessful. It is almost equally divided. You might claim that those are fake and manipulated surveys, but election results largely support them. You do not see some anti-immigration party getting 60% of the vote. And those surveys ask about the success of integration or potential new immigration, not about possible deportations of hundreds of thousands or millions. Such proposals would likely get much lower support. Many people on the right imagine that there is some kind of completely overwhelming silent majority upholding similar views as theirs, that is just held back by the barrier of lying media and politicians. When this barrier is breached, which is always just around the corner or after the next election, there will be some kind of revolution. That is illusory. I think it is mostly a result of the social media opinion bubbles. I recently started using X and saw how it looks when one's feed gets heavily skewed towards certain political biases. I followed some right-wing or anti-immigration politicians or commentators, and soon my feed got full of more or less radical, right-wing, anti-immigration shitposting accounts. No leftists were in sight, but one could just start a different account, follow different people, and he would soon be submerged in refugees welcoming anti-racist tweets full of climate anxiety and gender inclusiveness. It would also definitely not be a problem to have a feed full of tweets that would make one think that the socialist revolution is just around the corner in the West, since we are, once again, living in late-stage capitalism or something. But your typical voter is not some anonymous Twitter account posting pictures with ancient Greek sculpture aesthetics and quotes from Nietzsche. It is a 60-year-old boomer dad who likely thinks that immigration is just too much, but is far from being radical. I was previously speaking about the fact that in previous cases in history where such large-scale expulsions of populations took place, it was usually during the time of war or immediately after. That is crucial, since populations at those times were usually impoverished, hungry, used to complete mayhem and normalization of large-scale violence, and had a median age under 30 years. We are as far away from such a state of things in contemporary Europe as possible. Even with the economic situation not being particularly rosy, everyone is warm, has a full belly, and the average native European is over 50. Violence is a matter of movies and TV news for most. To conclude, the possibility of accumulating sufficient public support and institutional force to enact mass deportations of non-citizens is indeed very low. Do not get me wrong, there certainly might be some hardening of the rules. If you ask me, any asylum claimant or illegal immigrant who is convinced of seriously breaking the law should just go. That might happen, even though there are the aforementioned issues with non-responsive countries. But it won't be on a scale that proponents of remigration propose. The institutional pushback by the opposition and the liberal public, as well as the possible international repercussions, would be too large and could possibly throw the societies into complete internal chaos and resulting dysfunction. When it comes to large-scale denaturalization of citizens, the chance of that happening is probably not zero, but close to it. You have to keep in mind that due to intermarriage, there are many ethnically mixed couples with multi-ethnic children, and for such people, the issue would be highly serious and personal. The remaining options are twofold. The right can either up its game and try to match the left's skill in manning and using the power of institutions, especially state bureaucracies, courts, non-profits, media and such. If it succeeds, it might have a chance to not have any attempts at a hard stance towards immigration, integration and also deportations, hampered by the legal and institutional prowess of the left. Nevertheless, this option is complicated because a university education is the key to the successful penetration of institutions, and women exceedingly prevail among the university-educated youth in Europe. Women are markedly more liberal than men, with the gap only growing. Then there is the possibility of a complete change of the institutions, so basically some kind of revolution or regime change. If the desired changes just cannot be pushed through the current system, let's burn the system as a whole. Now, due to the combination of marked radicalization of European populations stemming from the worsening economic climate and growing frustration with immigration, one definitely cannot completely rule out such possibilities going into the future. However, even if all of these highly speculative scenarios somehow took place and European states underwent complete internal revolutions of the current system, all the external barriers described in the previous chapter would still be in place. So, you have two subsequent parts of the equation: internal and external. First, there would have to be a truly staggering change within the countries, likely a complete overhaul of the current constitutional framework and the relocation of levers of power from the current moloch of elitist managerial/bureaucratic/judiciary/academic institutions to some new center of gravity. Not particularly likely, but imaginable. Then, the real challenge would follow, which is the external part of the issue. So, how to technically facilitate something like mass deportations in a world in which the source countries won't accept the deported people, and Europe just does not have the levels of hard power or international clout required to pull something like that off. All that, while the new migration flows, especially from Africa, will inevitably gain strength in the coming years and decades, and European countries would thus stand in front of a combination of tasks, simultaneously handling massive new waves of immigration and facilitating mass deportations in a highly complex and adversary internal and external environment. To somehow conclude, when I speak about the demographic change that happened in Western Europe being permanent, this is what I have in mind. It will likely anger some of my viewers, but I believe it is the truth. The time to prevent this change, if one finds it undesirable, was decades ago. Now, the challenges are dealing with the societal consequences and preventing even more rapid change. I already mentioned Giorgia Meloni and how her results have been disappointing so far. Many people seem to operate under the impression that it is some kind of treason. She could have easily prevented the migration, but she just got a call from George Soros or something and changed her mind. I really do not think that is how it works. The issues at hand really are incredibly complex. Giorgia Meloni is currently trying to develop some comprehensive foreign policy towards Africa that would help mitigate the migration streams. I think she is honestly trying to figure it out. If people put their hopes in the politicians claiming they will realize remigration after being elected, I think they are just setting themselves up for major disappointment.